The words hit Sarah like a slap across the face as she pushed through the front door, her arms laden with grocery bags that threatened to spill their contents across the hardwood floor. "Where the hell have you been, USL*T?" Marcus stood at the bottom of the stairs, his face twisted into that familiar mask of contempt that had become as common in their home as the wedding photos still hanging on the walls, relics of a happiness that felt like it belonged to two completely different people. Sarah's hands trembled as she set the bags down carefully on the kitchen counter, each movement deliberate, controlled. She'd learned over the past 18 months to move slowly, to speak softly, to take up as little space as possible in her own home. The woman who had once commanded boardrooms and closed million-dollar deals had been reduced to this, a ghost tiptoeing through her own life. "I was at the grocery store," she said quietly, her voice barely above a whisper. "You said you wanted steak for dinner." "For 2 hours?" Marcus's voice rose, reverberating off the walls of their suburban colonial that had once represented everything they'd worked for together. "Do you think I'm stupid, Sarah? Do you think I don't know what you're really doing?" She didn't answer. There was no point. In the beginning, she tried defending herself, tried reasoning with him, tried to understand where this paranoid, angry version of her husband had come from. But explanations only made things worse. Facts didn't matter anymore. Logic had abandoned this house somewhere around the time Marcus lost his job at the architecture firm, though Sarah suspected the darkness had been lurking beneath the surface long before that, just waiting for the right catalyst to emerge. "Look at me when I'm talking to you." Sarah raised her eyes to meet his, seeing nothing of the man she'd fallen in love with 8 years ago. That Marcus had been ambitious, charming, attentive. That Marcus had surprised her with weekend trips to wine country, had memorized the way she took her coffee, had held her through the night when her father died. That Marcus had promised her forever. This Marcus was a stranger wearing her husband's face. "I'm sorry," she said, "because it was easier." Because those 2 words were a small price to pay for peace, even temporary peace. The store was crowded. Holiday shopping, you know. It took longer than I expected. He stared at her for a long moment, his jaw working, his hands clenched into fists at his sides. Sarah felt her heart hammering against her ribs, that familiar cocktail of adrenaline and fear flooding her system. Would tonight be the night he crossed the line from words to something worse? She'd been asking herself that question for months now, and each time he stopped just short of physical violence, she told herself it meant things weren't that bad. That she wasn't one of those women. That she could handle it, could fix it, could love him back to being the man he used to be. Finally, Marcus turned away, running a hand through his hair. Just make dinner. I'm going to watch the game." Sarah released a breath she hadn't realized she'd been holding. Another crisis averted. Another evening survived. She turned to the groceries, her hands still shaking as she began unpacking them, sorting items with mechanical precision. Steak, potatoes, asparagus, wine. All the ingredients for a dinner neither of them would enjoy, eaten in silence punctuated only by the sounds of whatever football game Marcus would pretend to care about while glaring at her over his plate. As she seasoned the steaks, Sarah's mind wandered to the place it always did these days, to before. Before Marcus's layoff. Before the drinking started. Before every conversation became a minefield. Before she learned to sleep on the very edge of the bed so she wouldn't accidentally wake him. Before she started making excuses to her friends about why she couldn't meet for lunch anymore, why she'd stopped going to yoga class, why she never answered her phone. Her best friend Jessica had tried to reach out just last week. The texts sat unanswered in Sarah's phone. "Haven't heard from you in weeks. Everything okay? Sarah, I'm worried about you. Call me. Please just let me know you're alive." Sarah had wanted to respond, had typed out messages and deleted them a dozen times. What would she even say? That her marriage was falling apart? That she was afraid in her own home? That she'd become someone she didn't recognize? The words felt too heavy, too real. As long as she didn't say them out loud, She could pretend things weren't as bad as they seemed. The steak sizzled in the pan, filling the kitchen with the rich aroma of searing meat and garlic. Sarah moved through the familiar motions of cooking, finding a strange comfort in the routine. In the kitchen, at least, she still had control. She could make something good, something perfect. If she could just be a good enough wife, make the right meals, say the right things, maybe Marcus would come back to her. Maybe the man she married was still in there somewhere, just buried under layers of anger and disappointment and wounded pride. Dinner was as tense as she'd anticipated. They ate in near silence, the television providing white noise that filled the space where conversation used to be. Marcus had opened a second beer before sitting down, and Sarah watched with quiet concern as he finished it quickly and retrieved a third. The drinking had become worse lately, another variable in an already volatile equation. "This is good," Marcus said suddenly, and Sarah looked up in surprise. He was focused on his plate, cutting into his steak. "The steak. It's good." "Thank you," Sarah said softly, and for just a moment, she felt a flicker of something she'd almost forgotten. Hope. Maybe tonight would be okay. Maybe this was a turning point. But then Marcus's phone buzzed, and she watched his expression change as he read whatever message had appeared on the screen. His jaw tightened. His knuckles went white around his fork. The storm clouds rolled back in. "Did you call your mother today?" he asked, his voice tight. Sarah's stomach dropped. This was a trap. She could feel it. "No, I haven't had a chance." "You haven't had a chance? What the hell do you do all day while I'm out looking for work? You sit around this house, spending my money, and you can't even pick up the phone to call your own mother." "I was planning to call her after dinner." "Of course you were." Marcus pushed back from the table, his chair scraping harshly against the floor. "You're always planning to do something, aren't you? Planning to look for work, planning to help with the bills, planning to be useful. But you never actually do anything, do you?" The accusation was so unfair it took Sarah's breath away. She'd been bringing in steady income from her freelance consulting work for the past 6 months, ever since Marcus had forbidden her from going back to her corporate job, claiming it was too stressful for their marriage. She'd adapted, found ways to work from home, to contribute financially while trying to keep the peace. But Marcus had a way of rewriting history to suit his narrative, and arguing with him only made things worse. "I'm sorry," she said again, the words automatic now, meaningless. "You're right. I should have called her." Marcus stood there for a moment, swaying slightly, and Sarah realized he was more drunk than she'd thought. The beer he'd had before dinner must have been his 4th or 5th, not his 2nd. Her pulse quickened. "I'm going out," he announced, grabbing his keys from the counter. "Marcus, you've been drinking. Don't tell me what I can and can't do," he roared, and Sarah flinched, pressing herself back against her chair. "I'm not one of your employees to boss around. I'm your husband." He stormed toward the door, then paused, turning back to look at her with something that might have been regret or might have been contempt. Sarah couldn't tell anymore. "Don't wait up," he said, and then he was gone, the door slamming behind him hard enough to rattle the picture frames on the wall. Sarah sat in the silence that followed, her dinner growing cold on the plate in front of her. Slowly, mechanically, she began to clear the table, scraping most of the food into the trash. Her appetite had vanished the moment Marcus started yelling. She washed the dishes by hand even though they had a perfectly good dishwasher, needing something to do with her hands, needing the ritual of soap and water and the rhythmic motion of scrubbing. It was only when she reached for a wine glass that her hand slipped, and the glass shattered in the sink. Sarah stared down at the broken pieces glittering in the soapy water, and something inside her broke along with it. She sank down onto the kitchen floor, her back against the cabinets, and let herself cry for the first time in months. Not the silent tears she sometimes shed in the shower or in her car, but real, racking sobs that came from somewhere deep and wounded in her chest. She cried for the marriage she'd lost, for the woman she used to be, for the life she'd thought she was building with Marcus. She cried for all the words she'd swallowed, all the time she'd apologized for things that weren't her fault, all the pieces of herself she'd carved away trying to make herself small enough, quiet enough, perfect enough to stop his anger. When the tears finally subsided, Sarah pulled herself up, washed her face in the kitchen sink, and looked at her reflection in the window above it. The woman staring back at her looked tired, defeated, lost. "This isn't living," she whispered to her reflection. "This is just surviving." The thought terrified her, because acknowledging it meant she had to make a choice. She could continue as she had been, walking on eggshells, hoping things would magically improve. Or she could do something about it. Sarah's phone sat on the counter where she'd left it. She picked it up, scrolled to Jessica's messages, and this time, she didn't delete her response. "Can we meet for coffee tomorrow? I need to talk." The reply came almost immediately. "Yes, thank God. 10 a.m. at Brewster's? I'll be there." Sarah sent back a simple thumbs up, then set the phone down, her heart racing. It was a small step, but it felt monumental. For the first time in a year and a half, she was reaching out. She was telling someone the truth. She was admitting that she couldn't do this alone anymore. Marcus didn't come home that night. Sarah lay awake in their bed, watching the ceiling fan spin lazy circles, listening to every car that passed on the street, wondering if this was the night he wouldn't come back at all. Part of her hoped he wouldn't. Part of her felt guilty for hoping. She must have dozed off sometime near dawn, because she woke to winter sunlight streaming through the curtains and the sound of the front door opening. Sarah sat up, her heart immediately accelerating, her body conditioned now to respond to Marcus's presence with anxiety. He appeared in the bedroom doorway, rumpled and bleary-eyed, still wearing yesterday's clothes. He looked at her for a long moment, and Sarah braced herself for another confrontation. "I'm sorry," he said instead, and the words were so unexpected that Sarah wasn't sure she'd heard him correctly. "I shouldn't have said those things last night. I was drunk and angry and I took it out on you, and that wasn't fair." Sarah stared at him, not trusting this sudden shift. She'd seen this pattern before, the explosion followed by the apology, the brief window of remorse before the cycle started again. "Where were you?" she asked. "Just driving around. I ended up at Dave's place, slept on his couch." Marcus ran a hand over his face, looking genuinely exhausted. "Sarah, I know I've been difficult lately. The job search, the rejections, feeling like I'm failing at everything, it's eating me alive. But that's not your fault, and I shouldn't take it out on you." He crossed the room and sat on the edge of the bed, and Sarah's instinct was to reach out to him, to comfort him, to tell him everything would be okay. But she stopped herself. How many times had she done exactly that? How many times had his apologies bought him another chance to hurt her? "Marcus, you can't keep doing this," she said quietly. "The drinking, the accusations, calling me names, it has to stop." "I know," he said, and he actually sounded sincere. "I know, and I want to fix this. I want to fix us." He turned to look at her, and for just a moment, she saw a flash of the old Marcus, the one she'd fallen in love with. "What if we did something for New Year's Eve? Just the two of us. Get dressed up, go to that French restaurant you love, start fresh in the new year. Would you do that with me? Give us one more chance." Sarah wanted to say no. She wanted to tell him that fancy dinners and promises weren't enough anymore, that she needed real change, consistent change. But there was something in his eyes, vulnerability, maybe, or genuine regret, that made her hesitate. "Okay," she heard herself say. "New Year's Eve. But Marcus, things really do have to change. I mean it." "They will," he promised. "I'm going to make this right, Sarah. I swear to you." He leaned in and kissed her forehead, and Sarah closed her eyes, wanting desperately to believe him. The coffee meeting with Jessica was both easier and harder than Sarah had anticipated. They met at Brewster's, a cozy cafe they'd been frequenting since college, back when their biggest worries were exams and bad dates and whether they could afford rent without asking their parents for help. Jessica arrived first, already seated in their usual corner booth when Sarah walked in. She jumped up immediately, pulling Sarah into a fierce hug. "Oh my God, I've missed you," Jessica said, and Sarah felt tears pricking at her eyes again. She'd forgotten how good it felt to be held by someone who actually cared about her well-being. They ordered lattes and settled into the booth, and for a few minutes, they just caught up on small things. Jessica's new promotion, her teenage son's drama at school, the kitchen renovation she and her husband were planning. Normal life things that felt foreign to Sarah now. "Okay," Jessica said finally, setting down her coffee and looking directly at Sarah. "Talk to me. And please don't tell me everything's fine, because I know you, Sarah Mitchell, and you haven't been fine for a long time." Sarah opened her mouth to deflect, to minimize, to protect Marcus the way she'd been protecting him for months. But sitting across from her best friend, in this safe space full of good memories, she found she didn't have the energy for lies anymore. "Marcus has been difficult," she began, and then the whole story came tumbling out. The verbal abuse, the controlling behavior, the constant criticism, the isolation, the drinking. Jessica listened without interrupting, her expression growing increasingly concerned. "Sarah," Jessica said when she finally finished, "that's domestic abuse. You know that, right?" The words landed like a punch. "He's never hit me," Sarah said quickly. "It's not like that." "Abuse isn't just physical," Jessica said gently. "Everything you just described, the name-calling, the controlling who you see, the constant criticism, making you apologize for things that aren't your fault, that's emotional abuse. And it's serious." Sarah shook her head, even though part of her knew Jessica was right. "He's just going through a hard time. The job loss, the stress." "Lots of people lose their jobs without becoming abusive to their partners," Jessica interrupted. "His struggles don't excuse his behavior. You know that, right? You would never accept this from anyone else. If one of your clients told you their partner treated them this way, what would you tell them?" Sarah was quiet, because she knew exactly what she would say. She'd say that person deserved better. She'd say they should get help. She'd say they should leave. "I don't know if I can," Sarah admitted quietly. "Leave, I mean. He's my husband. I took vows. For better or worse." "Worse doesn't mean abuse, Sarah. It means hard times that you face together, not one person tearing the other one down." Jessica reached across the table and took Sarah's hands. "I'm not saying you have to leave right now. That's your decision. But I need you to promise me something. Promise me you'll talk to someone, a counselor, a therapist, someone who specializes in this kind of thing. And promise me you'll keep talking to me. No more disappearing, okay?" Sarah nodded, tears streaming down her face. "Okay, I promise. And Sarah, if things get worse, if you ever feel unsafe, you call me. Day or night. You come straight to my house. Promise me that too." "I promise." They sat there for a while longer, and slowly Sarah began to feel something she hadn't felt in months. Not quite hope, but something like it. The possibility that maybe she didn't have to carry this alone. That maybe asking for help wasn't weakness but strength. The week leading up to New Year's Eve was surprisingly calm. Marcus stayed true to his word, cutting back on his drinking, being more considerate, actually having conversations with her instead of at her. He made jokes at dinner. He asked about her day. He even apologized one night for checking her phone, admitting it was a violation of her privacy. Sarah wanted to trust it. She wanted to believe that the man she'd fallen in love with was really coming back to her. But there was a voice in the back of her mind, maybe Jessica's voice, or maybe her own voice that she'd been suppressing, that whispered caution. That reminded her she'd seen good periods before, brief windows of normalcy that made her think everything was fine, right before things got bad again. Still, when New Year's Eve arrived, Sarah found herself getting genuinely excited. She put on her favorite black dress, the one Marcus had always loved, did her hair and makeup with care. Looking at herself in the mirror, she saw flashes of the old Sarah, the confident woman who had believed she could handle anything. Marcus was already dressed when she came downstairs, looking handsome in his charcoal suit. He let out a low whistle when he saw her. "You look incredible," he said, and the warmth in his voice felt real. "You clean up pretty well yourself," Sarah replied, managing a genuine smile. The restaurant was everything Sarah remembered. Intimate lighting, excellent wine, the kind of French cuisine that made you want to savor every bite. They were seated at a corner table, and for the first few courses, the evening was actually pleasant. They talked about neutral topics: the food, the restaurant's renovation since they'd last been there, the ridiculous New Year's Eve special on TV they used to watch together. But somewhere between the main course and dessert, something shifted. Marcus had ordered a second bottle of wine, and Sarah noticed he was drinking more than his share. His movements became a little slower, his words slightly slurred. That familiar tension crept back into her shoulders. "So," Marcus said, refilling his glass yet again, "I ran into Brian today." Brian was an old colleague from the architecture firm, someone who'd kept his job when Marcus lost his. Sarah's internal alarm bells started ringing. "Oh," she said carefully. "How is he?" "He's great, apparently. Just made partner. Got a huge bonus." Marcus's voice was taking on that edge she knew too well. "Must be nice, right? To have success just handed to you." "Marcus." "He asked about you," Marcus continued, leaning forward. "Asked if you were still doing that consulting work. Said he'd heard you were really thriving." The word thriving came out like an accusation. "I'm just doing my job," Sarah said quietly. "The same as I always have." "Yeah, must be easy to thrive when your husband is at home, unemployed, feeling like a failure." Marcus's voice was rising now, and Sarah was acutely aware of the other diners starting to glance their way. "While I'm struggling, you're just climbing higher and higher. Making me look like an idiot." "That's not fair," Sarah said, keeping her voice low. "My success isn't about you. I'm working hard because we need the income, Marcus. Because you asked me to work from home." "Oh, so now it's my fault?" He laughed, but there was no humor in it. "Everything's always my fault, isn't it? Poor Sarah, married to such a loser." "I never said that. I've never thought that." Sarah felt her eyes burning with tears, but she refused to cry here, not in public. "Can we please just finish dinner and go home?" "Why?" "So you can lord it over me some more? So you can sit there in your perfect dress with your perfect career and make me feel like such asterisk tea?" "Marcus, stop." Sarah's voice was shaking now. "You're drunk and you're making a scene. Please, let's just go." For a moment, she thought he might actually hit her. His hand twitched on the table, his face flushed with anger and wine. But then the waiter appeared, carefully neutral, asking if they needed anything else. The interruption broke the spell. Marcus stood abruptly, throwing his napkin on the table. "I need air," he muttered, and walked toward the restaurant's exit, leaving Sarah sitting alone with all the eyes in the restaurant on her. She sat there for a moment, humiliation washing over her in waves, before signaling the waiter for the check. She paid quickly, left a generous tip as an apology for the disruption, and went to find Marcus. He was outside, leaning against the building, smoking a cigarette. Sarah hadn't even known he'd started smoking again. "I called a car," she said quietly. "You've had too much to drink to drive." Marcus didn't argue, just took another drag of his cigarette, staring at the street. They rode home in silence, the driver clearly sensing the tension and keeping his eyes fixed firmly on the road. When they got home, Marcus went straight to the liquor cabinet, pouring himself a whiskey despite the fact that he could barely walk straight. Sarah stood in the doorway, still in her dress, watching him. "I'm done," she said, and the words surprised her as much as they seemed to surprise him.
Done with what?
Marcus asked, not looking at her. Done with this. With us. With pretending that this is a marriage instead of a nightmare. Now he turned to look at her, his eyes cold. You're leaving me? On New Year's Eve? Real classy, Sarah. You left me a long time ago, Sarah said, and she was surprised by how calm her voice sounded. The man I married would never treat me the way you do. He would never call me names or make me feel small or ruin a nice evening because he was jealous of my success. Oh, here we go, Marcus said, taking a drink. Poor Sarah, the victim. You know what your problem is? You think you're so much better than everyone else. You always have. You look down on me, on my struggles, on everything I'm going through. That's not true and you know it, Sarah said. I've supported you through everything. I've made excuses for you. I've apologized when I had nothing to apologize for. I've tried to be whatever you needed me to be. But it's never enough, Marcus.
Nothing I do is ever enough for you.
Maybe because you're not enough. The words exploded out of him, and Sarah felt them hit like physical blows. You're cold, you're selfish, you're more interested in your career than your marriage.
You're not the woman I thought I married.
Sarah stood there, letting the words wash over her, and realized something profound. They didn't hurt anymore. Or rather, they hurt, but they didn't touch the core of who she was. Because she knew they weren't true. She'd spent months believing his version of reality, letting him rewrite her story, but standing here now, she could see it all clearly. You're right, she said quietly. I'm not the woman you thought you married. I'm stronger than her. I'm done being your emotional punching bag. I'm done apologizing for existing.
I'm done with all of it.
She turned and walked toward the stairs, toward their bedroom, toward the closet where she kept a suitcase she'd secretly packed 2 days ago, after her coffee date with Jessica. Part of her had known, even as she'd gotten dressed for dinner tonight, that it might come to this. Where the hell do you think you're going? Marcus called after her. Somewhere safe, Sarah said without turning around. Somewhere I don't have to wonder what version of you I'm going to get. Somewhere I can remember who I am. She heard him following her up the stairs, his footsteps heavy and unsteady. You can't just leave, Sarah. We're married. You can't just walk out. Watch me. She pulled the suitcase from the closet, checking to make sure it had everything she needed: clothes, toiletries, important documents, some cash. Everything she'd need for at least a week while she figured out her next steps. This is because of your friend Jessica, isn't it? Marcus was standing in the doorway now, blocking her exit. She's been putting ideas in your head, making you think you're some kind of abuse victim. You're not abused, Sarah. You're just ungrateful. Sarah looked at him, really looked at him, and felt a wave of something that wasn't quite pity but wasn't quite anger either. It was clarity. Move, Marcus, she said calmly. Or what? You'll call the cops? Tell them I'm some kind of monster? They won't believe you.
I've never laid a hand on you.
No, you've just spent the last year and a half systematically destroying my self-esteem, isolating me from my friends, controlling every aspect of my life, and verbally abusing me whenever you felt like it, Sarah said, her voice steady. That's not love, Marcus. That's control. And I'm done being controlled. She stepped forward, and something in her expression must have convinced him she was serious, because he moved aside. Sarah walked past him, down the stairs, toward the front door. Her hands were shaking, but her steps were sure. If you leave now, don't come back, Marcus called from the top of the stairs. I mean it, Sarah. You walk out that door, we're done. I'll file for divorce. You'll get nothing. Sarah paused with her hand on the doorknob. From somewhere in the neighborhood, she could hear people counting down to midnight. 10, 9, 8. I don't want anything, she said, turning to look up at him one last time. Except my life back. 7, 6, 5. She opened the door and stepped out into the cold December night. 4, 3, 2. She pulled out her phone and called Jessica. 1. Happy New Year, Jessica answered on the first ring.
Where are you?
I'm outside my house, Sarah said, and she realized she was crying again, but this time they were different tears. I left him. I actually left him. Thank God, Jessica said, and Sarah could hear her moving around, probably grabbing her keys. Stay right there. I'm coming to get you. You're going to be okay, Sarah. You're going to be so okay. Fireworks were going off somewhere nearby, bright explosions of color in the dark sky. Sarah stood on the sidewalk in front of the house that had been her prison, her suitcase at her feet, and watched the sky light up. She had no idea what came next. She'd have to find a place to stay, figure out the divorce, probably go through therapy to process everything that had happened. There would be hard days ahead, days when she questioned her decision, days when she'd feel weak or scared or overwhelmed. But standing there under the fireworks, feeling the cold air on her face, hearing Jessica's car already turning onto her street, Sarah felt something she hadn't felt in a very long time. She felt free. Jessica's car pulled up, and her friend jumped out, running to pull Sarah into a tight embrace. You're safe now, Jessica whispered. You did it. You saved yourself. As they loaded the suitcase into the trunk and drove away from the house on Maple Street, Sarah looked back one last time. Marcus was standing in the window, silhouetted by the lights inside, but he looked smaller now. Less threatening. Just a broken man who had tried to break her too, and failed. Sarah turned away and looked forward instead, toward the road ahead, toward the new year, toward whatever came next. The clock had struck midnight, and somewhere in the distance, people were singing Auld Lang Syne, that old song about endings and beginnings, about remembering the past while stepping into the future. For the first time in 18 months, Sarah felt like the future might actually hold something good. 3 months later. Sarah sat in her new apartment, small but bright, with windows that let in the morning sun, and sipped her coffee while reviewing a contract for a new client. She'd expanded her consulting business, taking on 3 major accounts in the past month alone. Without the constant stress of walking on eggshells at home, she'd found her creativity and confidence returning in waves. Her phone buzzed with a text from Jessica. Lunch today? I have news. Sarah smiled and typed back. Absolutely. Noon at Brewster's? The divorce proceedings were moving forward. Marcus had contested it at first, tried to convince her to come back with promises of change that rang hollow. But Sarah had stood firm, with the support of a good lawyer, a great therapist, and friends who reminded her daily that she deserved better. She'd learned a lot in therapy about the cycle of abuse, about trauma bonds, about why leaving had been so hard and why staying had felt necessary for so long. She'd learned that she wasn't weak for enduring what she did, but she was strong for walking away. She'd learned that healing wasn't linear, that some days were harder than others, but that every day she woke up in her own space, making her own choices, she was reclaiming a piece of herself. There was a knock at the door, and Sarah opened it to find a delivery person with a large bouquet of flowers. For a moment, her stomach clenched. Had Marcus found her address? But the card was from her client, thanking her for her excellent work on their recent project. Sarah set the flowers on her kitchen counter and stepped back to look at them, really look at them. They were beautiful. Vibrant orange and yellow Gerbera daisies, her favorite. She'd forgotten, in all the years with Marcus, to mention things like favorite flowers or favorite anything. She'd learned to have no preferences, no desires, no needs of her own. Now she was learning to have them again. Her phone rang. It was her mother, who she'd been talking to regularly again, rebuilding a relationship that Marcus had tried to sabotage. Hi, Mom, Sarah answered, carrying the phone to the window where she could look out at the park across the street. Hello, sweetheart. Just calling to check in. How are you feeling today? Good, Sarah said, and realized she meant it. Really good, actually. I'm so proud of you, her mother said, her voice thick with emotion. I know these past few months haven't been easy, but you've been so brave." After they hung up, Sarah sat by the window for a while, just watching people in the park below. Couples walking dogs, parents pushing strollers, friends laughing together on benches. Normal life, continuing all around her. She thought about New Year's Eve, about the moment she'd walked out that door. At the time, she'd had no idea what was waiting for her on the other side. She'd been terrified, uncertain, convinced she was making a terrible mistake. But what had been waiting for her was this: freedom, self-respect, peace, the chance to rebuild her life on her own terms, the possibility of happiness that wasn't dependent on someone else's mood or approval. Marcus had been right about one thing that night. Sarah wasn't the woman he'd thought he married. She was better than that version of herself. She was the woman who'd found the strength to leave. The woman who'd chosen herself. The woman who'd looked at rock bottom and decided to climb back up. And that woman, Sarah thought as she returned to her work with renewed energy, was exactly who she was meant to be all along. The new year had delivered something she never expected. Not a fairy tale ending, not a perfect resolution, but something more valuable. A new beginning, and the wisdom to recognize it as the gift it was. Outside, the world turned toward spring, and Sarah turned with it, ready for whatever came next.